Brandon Wright was an experienced truck driver, but even he couldn't explain why he had to deal with strange events so often. He drove tens of thousands of miles across the United States, but what happened that night on Route 78, he could never forget. This track has long been known for its mystical reputation. They say that people often disappear on it, and cars passing through it sometimes do not return home. Drivers who wander there at night tell stories about strange lights, invisible pursuers, and phone calls that they can't explain. And although Brandon was a skeptic and treated these stories as urban legends, this time everything was different. Route 78, located in the desert areas of New Mexico, was virtually uninhabited after sunset. Brandon was riding in his old Freightliner, tired after a long day driving. He had to deliver cargo from Phoenix to Texas, and it was his last night on his way home. Already in the morning, as he was moving through the vast space, a huge figure appeared in front of him, standing on the side of the road. Brandon pressed the brakes instantly, as he initially thought it had knocked someone down. But no, the man stood completely calmly, not even moving. Brandon drove closer. She was a woman wearing a dark, shabby jacket and jeans, with hair that looked like she hadn't cut for many years. She didn't pay attention to the approaching truck. She stood like a stone statue. He stopped and decided to find out what had happened. He came out of the cabin and approached it. "Are you okay?" he asked, looking at her expressionless face. The woman did not respond. She just looked at him with a blank look that the whole universe was in her, then said the words that made Brandon feel cold. "You're here again. You won't get out." His heart missed a few beats. He didn't understand what she meant, but felt fear begin to spread all over his body. He tried to answer something, but she turned around abruptly and disappeared into the darkness. Brandon only had time to see her figure dissolve in the night air. What happened next, Brandon could not explain. The truck itself began to move forward, and Brandon had no choice but to get behind the wheel again. The road in front of him continued to stretch, and the only sign of life remained lonely lights on the horizon. However, in a few minutes, a loud hissing sound suddenly appeared on his radio. At first, Brandon thought it was a problem with the receiver again, but when he returned the setting, he heard clear words. "Don't go any further, the end is waiting for you." And the voice sounded as if someone was right in his cabin. He looked back at the rear window again. There was no one, no cars, nothing. "What the hell?" he whispered, pressing the gas again. But even with the engine overclocked, he could not overcome the invisible force that kept him in the middle of this nightmare. And suddenly, the moment he turned around, his eyes met the same red lights he saw at the beginning of his journey. They approached again, this time from the darkness, like a dangerous monster that did not give him a chance to escape. Route 78 was not only the place where the drivers also went, but also the place where they sometimes reappeared, in the form of ghosts that could not leave the place. Brandon thought he had become one of them. He turned his head around, and there was a shadow sitting in his front seat. It was a man, in a black jacket, with dark eyes, indicating that he felt nothing but boundless horror. "You won't believe it, but I was here, many years ago. And now you're here," the stranger said in a low voice, not taking his eyes off him. Brandon didn't answer. His brain couldn't cope with all the events. Only the words of the woman he saw on the side of the road turned in his head. "You won't get out?" The car drove up to the same place where he saw it, and now there was a waste in front of him. No road, no track, just a big black abyss. Like a trap, the truck was moving without a driver, and Brandon couldn't even control his actions. All that was left was to watch the dark silhouettes appear on each side and begin to absorb it. He couldn't believe it, but that night he became one of those who would stay on Route 78 forever. And when he had time in his eyes, he saw. The same ghosts he had seen on his previous trips were filling his van, swallowing him in the dark. And yes, a few hours later, when the police found his car, it was empty. Only mysterious traces have disappeared on the road leading into darkness. Route 78 remained empty, but full of ghosts waiting for the next driver. and Brandon became just another piece of this dark maze. Timur Gale did not believe in the supernatural. A van driver from the southern United States, he usually drove thousands of miles on a road where there was no soul or light. Nothing unusual. He got used to the sounds of the engine, monotonous conversations on the walkie-talkie, and the smell of gasoline that remained in the cabin. But that night everything changed. It was too late when he left Las Vegas, going through the open desert to reach Texas. The road was empty. Only distant lights lit up on the horizon. He was not in a hurry when suddenly an alarm signal began to sound in his radio. At first, it was just a background noise, similar to a hackneyed station. Timur tried to switch the wave, but suddenly there were clear words. "Don't stop. They are there." Timur twitched, but decided not to pay attention. I set up the radio again and continued moving. But after a few minutes, again this voice. "You're not alone. They are behind you." Timur felt the hair on the back of his head rise. The drivers he worked with often joked about strange people who supposedly took over distant paths and ghostly motorists moving without drivers. These were just urban legends, but this situation seemed very real. He tried to dispel his fears by pressing the brakes when he saw the first lights in the dark. And these were not the usual headlights. They were too bright and carried some strange yellow tint. Timur could not understand where these lights came from, because there was no car around, not even signs about the following cities. That's why he quickly decided to accelerate. The light increased again, and now trucks began to appear from the horizon. But these were not ordinary trucks. Their headlights emitted an unusual, pulsating light that seemed to beckon him. Timur lost his vigilance, just driving into this row of cars that suddenly appeared. But as soon as he was among them, his truck began to behave not as usual. The truck began to move on its own, and the brakes and steering wheel seemed completely ineffective. Timur felt his hands, which had held the steering wheel tightly before, lost control of the machine. He tried to press the brakes, but the truck continued to move, as if it had driven into some deeper spaces, where all the sounds disappeared and reality began to be distorted. "You're not alone. They are waiting." A voice sounded again in the radio, this time very close, as if someone was whispering directly into the cabin. Timur turned around with horror, but the cabin was empty. The road in front of him was getting darker. Sometimes the headlights reflected only empty sand waves that looked like frozen shadows. And suddenly, on the road in front of him, a car appeared. A classic old model, covered with rust, with a dirty windshield. The driver of this car was not moving, and the car was standing right in the way. Timur could not dodge and crashed into her. The machine absorbed everything. Its front part absorbed the truck completely. And the moment Brandon thought it was all over, the city appeared before him again. And although everything looked familiar, I felt again that something was wrong here. "You're in danger," said a voice on his radio. "No one will come out of here alive." Timur felt that he could no longer stop the car, and although he didn't want to, it all looked as if his life was determined even before he was here, in this empty night desert. Suddenly, the van started, and nothing else was seen except the dark silhouettes that quickly approached, trying to drown him out in this endless tunnel of night horror. The city was left behind, and there was no way forward. A few hours later, when the police found the car, it was empty, and so far, no one can explain why the drivers crossing this road disappear. Kyle Hendricks has been a truck driver for over a decade. During this time, he traveled almost all over the United States, from Vancouver to Miami, from New York to Los Angeles. And although he never believed in legends or mystifications, the route he had to take that night made him seriously think about whether there was something in the world that could not be explained. Route 89, which runs through the mountainous areas of Utah, was known for its loneliness and remoteness. It was the perfect place for drivers who didn't like to stop and talk to others. The radio signal weakened, and only dark, endless plains spread around. Kyle turned on the headlights, but still couldn't see anything but the endless darkness. Around 3 a.m., he heard a strange crack on the radio. At first, he thought it was just a failure, but after a few seconds, words came to him, clear, cold. "You shouldn't be here. Go back." Kyle was surprised. He definitely didn't tune the radio to a station. His gaze involuntarily shifted to the instrument panel. Everything was fine, but this voice did not give him peace. He pressed the button on the radio while trying to change the station, but the sound remained. "You're not alone. They are waiting for you." Kyle became nervous. It could have been a joke, or one of his colleagues decided to play tricks on him in this way, but why did he think that the voice sounded so close? He looked at the street again and immediately shuddered. 2 red lights suddenly appeared in front of him. It was not a car, but something like a constant point of light. They sparkled like the eyes of some wild beast, which is getting closer. His hands reached for the steering wheel, but they were some kind of strange softness, completely powerless. He pressed the gas sharply, but the track remained empty. Only these 2 red lights on the horizon. The more he tried to leave this place, the more he felt the track trap him. After a few minutes, when it seemed that he had already completely lost control, one of the lights suddenly flashed brightly and approached. Kyle couldn't even tell if it was a car or something else. The light flashed in the darkness, and he realized that the headlights were already very close. In the next moment, Kyle heard a sharp sound, as if something big was crashing into his car. He squirted from the impact, losing his balance on the steering wheel. Right here, when everything froze in silence, he realized that he was in a terrible situation. The track suddenly broke off, and he stopped on the spot. There was only a black void around, but it wasn't just a dark place. Between the trees growing on the side of the road, you could see many clusters of some silhouettes. They stood completely motionless, looking at him with empty eyes. Kyle felt a cold sweat running down his back, and he couldn't move any further. And at that moment, the radio told him with another voice, "We've been here for a long time. You're lost." Before he could catch his breath, Kyle noticed one of the silhouettes approaching him. It was a man, but her face was crooked, as if stretched to impossible proportions. His skin was gray, dead. He slowly approached the van without making a sound. Kyle tried to start the engine, but it did not react. He twitched and jerked the starter, trying to recover any reaction, but everything was in vain. He had already begun to panic when suddenly the man who was approaching reached out to him, as if trying to take something. "They won't give you a choice." His voice sounded like a cold wind penetrating into every cell. And it was then that Kyle heard his last signal. A voice from the radio, which now sounded not like a warning, but like a sentence. "You can't leave this place." It seemed that the minute had turned into eternity, and only the moment Kyle tried to escape, everything immediately unraveled. The darkness swallowed him up, and the whole car disappeared with him. The police only found an empty truck the next morning, standing right on the edge of the road. And although of course no one has ever found Kyle, locals say that Route 89 is not just a path, but also a trap for showers who cannot get out of its labyrinths. Edward Ed Carter has been a truck driver for over 20 years, and although he saw many strange and scary things on the roads of America, this time his encounter with darkness surpassed anything he could ever imagine. This night started in the same way as many others. He left Tucson, Arizona, and carried the cargo to Seattle. The road was empty, and only the shine of the trucks on the horizon reminded him that he was not completely alone. He didn't like to drive at night, but always thought it was just part of his job. Nevertheless, tonight was a special night. It was the moment when she turned into something that even he couldn't explain. As always, Ed was chained to his cabin, listening to another program on the radio. Suddenly, a red light appeared before him, which instantly increased in size. He first thought it was the headlights of another approaching car, but something was wrong. The light did not move, and it soon became obvious that it was just hanging in the air. Ed's heart was caught. He slowly pressed the brakes, trying to stop the car. But the more he tried to drive the truck, the more it moved on its own. And so, instead of braking, the truck began to gain speed. It was impossible to believe if it was a ghost or the road itself dragged him into the abyss. Suddenly, the light in front of him changed. It no longer looked like a normal headlight. It was a huge sphere of light that reached out to him like an unstoppable force. He tried to turn the car to the side, but his hands no longer obeyed. The truck continued to move directly into the light. At the moment when he thought he was about to cut into an invisible wall, the light suddenly went out. He didn't understand what had happened. The road became empty again. Everything around became deeper darkness. At first, he thought he had just lost control because of fatigue, but then he noticed that the light from his headlights was not reflected from the asphalt. It literally absorbed everything around. "What was that?" he whispered, trying to take a deep breath to calm his heart. A muffled crack in the radio made him jump up. The signal was clear, but the voice that began to sound was completely cold and ruthless. "You won't stay here alive." He wanted to turn off the radio, but it didn't help. A voice sounded right in his head. Unexpectedly, light appeared before him again. Now it was even brighter, like the whole sun. He pressed the brakes, but the truck never stopped. And then he realized, it's not just a ghostly driver who didn't give him peace. It's something much scarier. "You're with us now," the voice said, and now it sounded right next to us, like a whisper from the dark. Ed turned his head out and saw that dark figures appeared on both sides of the road. They moved silently, who knows where they came from, and had no face. They walked next to his truck, and each of their steps left dark marks on the asphalt, which later stretched like red threads that were difficult to erase. Ed, unable to tolerate it any longer, decided to leave the cabin. He opened the door abruptly and immediately felt someone, or something invisible, infiltrating his body. He hurriedly ran out of the van, but instead of feeling the coldness of the desert, his body was enveloped by the heat of the dark force which dragged him back to the truck. He tried his best to escape from this inexplicable horror, but he had nowhere to go. As soon as he took a few steps, his feet began to toe on the asphalt, and it seemed that the ground was swallowing him. He turned his head to his tracks on the road again, and what he saw frozen him in horror. All the traces of his feet became red and light, as if left by traces of blood. They stretched to the end of the horizon, where everything became darker and darker. And so, when he felt that his legs could no longer walk, and when his back was almost broken with physical pain, the dark figures approached again. "Stay with us," they whispered in the dark. The night broke before him, and when he turned to see what was waiting beyond the horizon, he realized that there was no more asphalt or road in front of him. Everything turned black, and at the very moment when the dark figures raised their hands, he fell into a black abyss from which there was no way out. When the police found the truck, they saw only one strange thing: the tracks leading from the van to the remote edge of the highway, where they were swallowed up by the abyss. And no one else saw Ed Carter. It is said that sometimes, when the nights get too dark and the asphalt in front of the driver begins to stretch, traces appear on the road. They stay, waiting for those who are lost. And when the trucks approach, the tracks lead them straight into the abyss. Josh Collins has been a truck driver for many years. He had his own company, a small van and a normal schedule, every day at the same time. He went to the roads of America without thinking about any dangers. He got used to empty trails, night trips, and the foggy world that opened up to him in the distance. But that night, when he was leaving Los Angeles in the direction of Denver, everything changed. It was late autumn. The fog thickened, and the invisible but tangible wind, which always moved through deserted roads, seemed especially thick this night. Josh decided that for speed, it would be best to take a shorter route, an old track that led through the mountains in which almost no one dared to enter due to frequent accidents. His truck, manufactured several decades ago, went on a night trip. Josh was driving himself, silently swallowing portions of cold coffee from the thermos, when suddenly his radio buzzed and began to transmit strange signals. He pressed the button to switch the station, but the radio continued to whine and hiss. "You have to go back," Josh heard a few seconds later. His heart tightened. It wasn't a crash or a joke. The voice sounded so clear, as if someone was talking from it through the microphone. At that moment, it seemed to him that something was wrong. "You shouldn't go this road," the voice was calm. But Josh felt a faint fear in his body. He did not believe in prejudice, but it had already begun to go beyond the limits of reason. He decided to ignore the voice. Maybe it's just outdated equipment, or someone on the other side of the radio who decided to play it. Josh pressed the gas, trying to continue on his way, despite the strange crackling and signals on the radio. But every minute it got worse. The fog around became thicker, and visibility decreased to several meters. Josh tried several times to increase the speed to get out of this trap, but with each of his movements, he seems to have plunged even more into the unknown depths of this dark night. Suddenly, on the right side, he saw a small flashing light. At first, he thought it might be another machine that also travels this desert road. He slowed down and slowly approached the fire. When he pulled up, what he saw was to throw him out of balance. The light was not the headlights of the car, but a small hearth burning in the center of the old cemetery. There were several people standing by the fire. They didn't move, just stood in the dark. Their shadows looked incredibly long because of the fire. Josh froze, not knowing whether to drive closer or not. "You can't get out of here," the same clear message from his radio came again. Josh tried to turn the van back, but suddenly felt the front wheels of the truck stop. Sometimes it happens that the truck falls into some hole or a small trap, but in this case he could not explain why the car no longer moved. He pressed the gas again, but the engine did not respond. The fog became more and more dense, and it seemed to be literally absorbing the car. At this moment, Josh felt the cold penetrating every cell of his body. Josh opened the door and got out of the van. His legs immediately lost their balance, and he barely resisted. The fog around became so thick that it could not see more than a few meters. And that's when he heard this sound. Strange, quiet, almost indistinct, but it became clearer and clearer. These were steps. Josh grabbed the walkie-talkie and tried to contact some driver again. He called for help, but the walkie-talkie only repeated the same thing to him. "They're waiting for you." With each of his steps, the darkness became even more oppressive. His heart was beating faster, and he realized that he was losing touch with reality. It seemed to him that he was no longer on the roads, but in some ancient labyrinths where time and space no longer made sense. And suddenly he saw them. The people standing by the fire began to move. Their faces were distorted, broken, but they approached him like shadows, without any sound. He could feel some indescribable aura coming from them, something ugly and terrible. Josh returned to the truck and rushed to the door, but a new figure appeared in front of him, big, dark. She stood, silently, as if she was waiting. His every movement was slowed down, and the fog became so dense that even his own hands became almost invisible. His lips stretched in horror when he realized that he had no way back. Those around him were not people. They were creatures belonging to another world, and their gaze was unrestrained and ruthless. When Josh's body was discovered in the morning, his eyes were wide open, and his fingers were clutching the last piece of walkie-talkie, from which a cold voice was still heard. "You couldn't get out of here. Locals say that if someone goes this way, they too can get to the same path, a non-return path where there is no way out, and every attempt to escape only makes the situation." Blake Sullivan was an experienced truck driver who knew all the ways between New York and Los Angeles. He made hundreds of flights through deserts, mountains, much of the United States, and nothing scared him more than the loud sound of the radio at night or the rustling in the headphones that shuddered as the car drove through the pits. But the night he took the cargo to Chicago was different. Blake moved out of a small town on the outskirts of New Mexico. He knew this road well. He traveled on Route 66, old and long, which led through endless steppes, crossing small towns and old mining settlements. The night was quiet, only the hum of the engine and the dark horizons around. The fog began to subside from the first minutes of his journey, but at first Blake did not pay attention to it. He only slightly increased the speed, knowing that this way he could get out of this remote region faster. But after a few hours, the fog became thicker. At first it was just a cloud hanging over the road, but with each mile he could feel this foggy mass getting closer and closer. And suddenly, as Blake passed through a narrow part of the track where there was no housing for dozens of miles, the radio suddenly began to erupt a clear voice, which immediately broke the silence in the cabin. "Don't go any further." Blake was surprised and pressed the volume control, but the voice continued to sound. "You can't go back." Everyone who went on was gone. It was not the usual radio signal. It was a human voice that sounded like a whisper, as if on the other side of the walkie-talkie. Blake decided it was just a failure. He did not believe in the nonsense and decided not to pay attention. He was already walking at high speed, and it was too late to go back. But when he drove to the intersection, the fog became so thick that he could not see anything in front of him. He pressed the brakes and his truck stopped. Everything around was completely black, dark. It seemed that he was in another world, where there was no time and space. And then, after a few seconds, he saw something that made his heart freeze. A shadow appeared in front of the thick fog. She moved quickly like an invisible force, and it seemed that she just appeared out of nowhere. She increased as she approached him. Blake panicked and tried to start the car, but the engine did not respond. Panic gripped him. The shadow was getting clearer, and now he saw that it was a figure of a man dressed in antique clothes, with a blurred, blank look. Her arms were spread out, and she moved without sound, without breaking the silence of the night. Blake tried to start the engine again, but he could no longer hear anything but his own heartbeat. "You can't leave this place," a voice came from the radio again, and this time it didn't sound like a warning, but like a sentence. The figure began to approach the truck, her feet not touching the ground, but as if floating in the air. She moved slowly, but Blake felt how her every step increased the anxiety in his chest. He realized that he had no way to get out of this place, and suddenly the figure disappeared as it appeared. Blake couldn't figure out what happened, but everything around became quiet and empty. The fog began to melt, and he saw that there was a large cemetery on the right side of the track. It was a place he had never seen, although he often drove this road. The cemetery looked old, almost forgotten, with broken tombstones and graves covered with moss for a long time. Feeling his heart pounding, Blake decided to get out of the truck and take a closer look at the place. Walking slowly towards the cemetery, he suddenly saw an old cemetery gate, which always seemed to him unnaturally new for such an abandoned area. He approached them and tried to touch the large steel gate, but as soon as his hand touched the metal, it seemed to him that the whole world around him was froze. Immediately, he felt the terrible pressure on his chest, as if the air had become heavy, like lead. Meanwhile, his eyes saw the inscription on the gate, "Dead Point. Those who cross the line never come back." At the same moment, Blake felt the darkness swallow him, and everything around became black and white. Feeling his strength leaving his body, he realized that he no longer had the opportunity to go back. His feet stopped obeying him. He began to feel the air, like invisible hands, squeezing him. The next morning, when the police found the truck, it was standing in the middle of the road, covered in dust, without any traces leading to it. The radio was on full volume, but only one thing was heard from it: "Those who get here won't find a way out anymore." Michael Rose, an experienced truck driver, wouldn't be afraid of any competition on the way. For 10 years, he traveled continuously on the roads of America, making flights from coast to coast. No bad weather, No terrible night, no experience like this could scare him. He knew he would move until he delivered the cargo to his destination. But that night was different. It all started with the call of his dispatcher before sunset. "Michael, I have a special load for you," said the voice on the other end of the line. "You need to go to a very remote place. You will come to the desert. You will go along the old Road 50. As soon as possible." Michael was surprised. He knew Highway 50 well, which is one of the oldest roads, and most drivers avoided it due to numerous unexplained disappearances and outdated infrastructure. "Don't worry, it's an ordinary cargo. Only a little different specificity," the dispatcher added, and Michael couldn't help but notice the fear in his voice. And although he was uncomfortable, he still agreed. He had no choice. The cargo is important, and the money for such a flight was not bad. Michael took the goods and set off at night. The road was deserted. The perfect time to travel, but also the perfect time to feel on the edge. He drove through a series of empty towns, crossing steppes and fields, and the deeper he went into the desert, the more he felt the cold breath of the night. Closer to midnight, he was already on the old 50th highway, which was known for its ruthless nature. Michael didn't pay attention to his surroundings when suddenly his headlights illuminated something strange. A dark silhouette appeared far ahead on the road. It was a truck, but not ordinary. The trucks are always on the road, but for some reason it did not move, as if it had frozen in time. Her headlights were off, and the engine was silent. This was very unusual for the night, when even the smallest towns or villages on such a road usually have traffic at night. Michael slowed down, drove closer, and stopped. To his surprise, there was no driver in the cabin. The truck looked dead, and even more surprising was the fact that there were no markings on its body, no logos or numbers. It was just a gray, unremarkable car. Michael looked around in confusion, then quickly looked around the place. He left the cockpit for a moment, but when he touched the body, he again felt an inexplicable feeling, as if something invisible was dragging him into the abyss. The moment he wanted to go back to his truck, the radio he left on began to hiss wildly. Michael looked at the screen. It wasn't just a radio broadcast. He clearly heard a voice from the other end, which was so familiar, but at the same time terrible. "You shouldn't have stopped." Michael was instantly frightened and grabbed the door handle of his truck, trying to return to the cabin. But suddenly he saw a small note that was glued to the front glass of another truck. He began to read in surprise. "Cargo without purpose. No one should come here. Don't take the cargo." Michael felt something strong in his soul covering him like a cold wind, and suddenly a thought flashed in his head. What if the cargo of this van was not intended for him? The feeling of anxiety grew. He quickly returned to his truck and got behind the wheel, about to leave. But immediately I noticed that in the place where he was before, several more trucks began to appear, absolutely the same. They walked one after the other, standing exactly like the previous one. Strange, faceless, with a black body trim, they seemed to conquer the space around. The source of the terrible feeling he felt only grew. It wasn't just trucks. These were closed puzzles that connected this empty desert with something deeper and darker. Every cargo had a purpose, but not for this world. Unexpectedly, one of the trucks moved forward. She was moving at a speed that became more and more supernatural. Michael felt the cold that pierced his bones. The truck seemed to live its own life, moving with an invisible force into a completely dark horizon. He grabbed the walkie-talkie and tried to call for help, but the signal did not come. And when he looked at the road again, he saw it. The road was blurred, erased, and these horrible trucks disappeared into the fog, just like the desert itself, which he could no longer recognize. Michael turned his truck back and began to move back, although he already knew that even if he returned, there would no longer be the world he had left. And when he was discovered a few days later, he still couldn't explain what had happened. His truck was empty, but there were terrible traces on its body, like blood. No record was found. The radio just said, cargo without purpose,